So welcome to day 17, guys. A little recap from yesterday's class. We talked about how we can take the user input and then update the state and then reflect the state back to the user. So what I mean by that, in the product name in here, as the user types in, we'll update the state. We'll take a look what happening to this particular component as I type it and give it an inspect. Right click, go to the components, and on the products, as you see in the state in here, I'm updating a value in the state. And as soon as I type something into the state, you can see the state has been updated. And I'm listening the state back into the view. And that is the reason as I type, I'm able to see the component reflecting. And this is a controlled component. Okay, folks, this is a controlled component because the React has the control over this component. And there are other type of component we discussed yesterday, which is an uncontrolled component. In this case, the name variable inside the state is holding the value. This is a controlled component. Now, the interview question would be, what is a controlled component versus an uncontrolled component? Sorry, I keep telling this component because we discussed about the class component, pure component, memo component, functional component. This is called a controlled input versus an uncontrolled input. A controlled input is nothing but you have two things. The difference between a controlled and an uncontrolled input is two things. This is an uncontrolled input because the React does not have a control over this input until I have a value. If I throw in a value to this input, which I would say something, and then give it a refresh, which I would automatically be done by the browser because I'm using the Webpack live reload here. And now I go ahead and try to change the something string, and I would not be able to do it. You can see as I type on my keyboard, it doesn't change because that is controlled by the React world. So this is a controlled component. But if I do not have a value in here, that becomes an uncontrolled component. So the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled component is that, again, I'm reiterating, an uncontrolled component manages its own state, and that state belongs to the browser. A controlled component is managed by the React state. It doesn't have to be a state variable. You can hardcode the values, but doesn't make any sense if to hardcode the values in there. You have to take the input from the user. All right, folks. So to make an uncontrolled component as a controlled component, you need two things: a value. The component, the input has to have a value, and an on-change listener. Adding these two things will make any uncontrolled component a controlled component. Okay, folks. So I'll do this. I'm trying to change handle name change in here. I would try to add the same variables to the price as well. So I would do this dot state. Guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. For some reason, Wi-Fi got disconnected. Okay, so you can able to see my screen as well, right?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
You can see.
Sure, awesome. So let's go ahead. The only way you can make an uncontrolled component a controlled component is adding only two things: the value and an on-change listener. And I'm trying to add an on-change listener to the price and the handle. I'm also adding a value to the price, and also what happens when the user types a price change. Okay, I'm adding two functions in here. Same thing, I would bind that functions in here. I would create another function in here. Okay. And instead of name change, I would say price change, price, and I'm creating another variable inside my state called price, which is blank, and price change, and then listen back the same variable in here. So let's see what happens if I start typing into my price variable, a price input. As you can see now, price is updating and my name is also updating. And let's do the same thing for the image and the category as well. All right, so same thing in here, copy this guy. Image, handle image, same thing in here, instead of say category, and then handle category change. And copy the category here, and then also copy the image change in here. And recreate these functions. Instead of category change here, and image change here, and image here. And then I would say image in here, and category. Same thing, image and a category. And I have to start listening to category, image change, and category change. Let's give it a quick run and see if we are good. I'm just removing the console messages to make it clear. And then give it an inspect. Components. And let's see if everything is updated. This is my name. Looks like it's updating. Price. It's updating. Okay, so looks like something is wrong with my category and name. So let's see what happened. What is happening here? So instead of image, category, and handle image. Oh, so I'm instead of category change, I'm changing an image in here. So go back, set that back again, and give a refresh. Name change, price change, URL change, and a category change. Awesome. So this is how we change the data from a user and then reflect back the same data to the user so he knows what he's typing, and also we update the state. All right, folks. Now I have to post this data to an API. So I have my Supercard database in here. I have to post the data to a database. So let's actually see how does my data looks like right now. And in yesterday's class, we went over how we can use a Postman, a little handy tool where you can post the data to an API. Right now, we would use a post method, or let's try to use a put. We'll try to use a post method, and then we'll switch back to using a put method. We'll see the challenge of using a post method, and then we'll come back and use a put method. All right. So whenever I use an add, whenever I click an add button in here, I need to get the data from the user, which is this form in here. So I have to get this form data and post the data onto the database. So on the button as well, you would have a synthetic event on click. We went over this when we try to add the items into the cart. Is equal to this dot handle add. Okay, and I recreate that function in here. I would also bind that function in here, handle add, and then I would create the same function in here, handle add, and then I'll just try to console log on which item that I'm or what is the form data that I'm adding to the database. So let's do this. As soon as I handle add, I would just console log the current state because our user have typed all the information onto the inputs. So I'll just try to check if I'm able to get the input data onto my handle add. I don't need the event in here because this is not a synthetic event generated because I can still get the synthetic event, but I do not care about the value. I only care about the on-click event. If the on-click event is happening or not, there's no value as such associated with this button click. So I don't need the event in here. So console log, this is the form data. And how do I get the data? The entire this dot state is updated whenever I click my add data, right? So let's do a simple console login here. And I'll try adding the data in here and click on the add button. And that should print me the entire state of this component. And you can see it's just getting me the entire state of this component, this dot state, which is the entire state, right, folks? Now, what I would do is I would use a fetch library to post this data onto the database. Okay, are we clear until this far?
Yeah.
All right, so let's move and use a library called fetch. You guys already know about this library. So let's go step by step. So I have to use a fetch library, okay, and to which date URL I should post to? You guys remember which URL should I post to? Should I hard code the product URL in here, or this is a better approach we already created? If you guys remember, we already created
the URL, directly the URL, what is it? Get products API, yeah, the URL name.
Right, awesome. So we already created a constant that we're gonna use right in here, okay? So get products API. Usually, it's not always the case. I mean, it is the case, it really depends on how your API backends are set up. Sometimes you would have a different API to get the data and a different API to put the data. Okay. Sometimes to get the data, there is no additional validation that you need to do. And a lot of times, if you're putting a data, there would be a different API, and the API would be there would be an intermediate server or a middleware that checks the validity of your data, if your data is valid or not before posting to the database. So that you might have a different API endpoint, but in our case, we will use the same endpoint, and then we'll try to post the data onto the API. Okay, folks? So I would just replicate the same thing again, and I would say post products API, and then I would get the post products API in here, post products API, and that should auto import it in here. All right. And then now, what if I'm trying to do a default API? What if I do a default fetch call? I'll get back the data, but I have to specify. I need to put the data or post the data in this case, right? So I need to post the data. So this fetch function takes a second argument, which is an object, and that object you can specify a key telling, hey, fetch, listen, this is not about getting the data. This is about posting the data. This is about writing the data. It's not about retrieving the data. So the method we're gonna use is post. Okay. And what is the data that we are trying to post? We are trying to post the entire this dot state, right? The entire this dot state. But look at how the JSON structure on the API. Look at each JSON object. What does all it have? It has a category, ID, image, is in cart, name, and a price, right, folks? So we'll try to match the JSON structure, and we'll only try to post the structure in a way we post it on the API. Okay. So let's do this. Go to post. So this is the method that this is the HTTP method that I'm using. This has a second argument to it, which is a body. The body is nothing but the piece of data I'm trying to post onto the database. All right, folks. This is the body that I want to post the data to the database, to write to the database. And this body does only take string. It does only take strings. It doesn't take any other data type. What we do is we stringify the entire this.state object. So we'll try to create a fake object and then populate that fake object with the data that we have it in the state. So what I would do in here is constant, I would say payload, because this is the payload that is being carried by the fetch call and posted on the database. So the payload would be something like this. I'll try to match the exact same object structure that I see on the database. So I need a category. And how do I get the category? Arjun, how do I get the category here?
Category this object. Where is object?
This is all my every updated value is always in the inside my state.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But I'm updating my state, right? So I would get this dot state dot category. All right.
Yeah.
And then what is the next key I need in here? I would need an ID in here.
ID.
Okay, guys, this is we are trying to use a fake database in here. In a real world scenario, in real times, the ID will be created by the backend. You do not have a control over the ID. Okay, so the backend would create that ID for you. In this case, what I would do in here is I would try to match the ID with the key and we'll try to post it. So I have an ID of 29 in here. There's no middleware in here that can create a unique ID for me. So I would go ahead and use the same ID. I'm just hard coding it in here, but we'll take it to a next step where we would not hard code it, but we'll get the ID based on the number of products. For now, I'm just hard coding the value. So ID is 30. All right. And then what I need an image. And the image I grab it from the state because the user have typed the image and the state has been updated. So I grab it from the state. And then I would need a eSIM card because this is the first time I'm adding the product. It would be definitely not in the card, right? So this is false in here. And then what do I have? I have a name, which I grab it from as a user types in this dot state dot name. And then I need a price, which I can get it from this dot state dot price. All right. And then what I do is, this is the payload, but this payload is a JSON object. It's a JavaScript object. My body only supports the body parameter in here only takes a string. It does not take any other data type. So what I do in here is I stringify it. I convert the entire payload into a string. And if you guys remember from validating the props from this props to previous props, we used a JSON method that can convert your object into a string. Okay, so I would say constant payload as a string. And I would use JSON.stringify. And that stringify will take this object and will convert the payload into a string. Okay, and I'm posting it on the body. I would use a payload as a string variable because that is the string variable that I'm using in here, right, folks? So I give it a save and I give it a click on the add and let's see what happens. Name, I would say fake name, 200. And the product image is I can grab any image. So there is a website that gets a random image each time you go get an image. So that is called Lorem Ipsum. Oh, Lorem Pixel. So this is a website that gets you a random image every single time you click on something. So Lorem Pixel by 200 by 200 would get you an image of 200 by 200 ratio of 200 by 200 pixels. So I would use the same URL in here. And I would use some random category and click on the add button. Let's throw in a debugger in here and see what's going on. Okay, so I would throw in a debugger right in here. Okay, and since my console, I'll open up a console in here. And as soon as I do a fake product 200 I would lorem ipsum category, some random category. And this is all updating my state as I start typing in. And as soon as I hit the add button, it should stop me at the debugger, and let's inspect what's going on inside the handle head. Now, what would be this dot state dot category in here? If I do that, and let's inspect the payload in here. So if you inspect the payload in here, every single thing I typed on the UI is copied into the payload. So you can see the category is random category, ID is 30 and all of stuff. And then I give this and look how it is being converted into string. So let's do here. This is the payload, which is an object. Okay, which is an object in here. You can see this is an object of type object, and then payload as a string. Now this is a string here. It's surrounded by the double quotes. That's a string in there. Okay, and then I'll make I'll make it to go to the next stop by just hitting continuing the debugger and see what happens on the UI on the database. All right, as soon as I hit the add button, you can see there is a new record has been added to the database, and you open up that record, you can able to see the values that I entered into the input. This is how you integrate or post the data to a database using a post or a put. Right now we're using a post method. We're gonna soon use a put method. Okay, and 50% of the time you get the data, another 50% of the time you write the data to the database, and everything is done by using an API. If you are a front-end developer and you need to integrate the API with your application, there's always a back-end developer who gives you a sample of how the API would look like. If it's a get API, he would give you a sample, because when you start developing, the backend might not be ready, right, folks? The backend might not be ready, and they say, "Hey, Arjun or Karthik, this is the API which is not ready yet, but when you hit this API, you get a data structure which is very similar to this." He would give you a structure of the data or the JSON structure. This is a payload. This is the response. This is the response. How would you look like? You grab that response and you start coding depending on that response. Okay, you start looking at the keys. You start doing all the crazy stuff using the keys inside that response. Because if you do not know the response, how do I go and how do I iterate? For example, in my app.js in here, if I do not know what is the response that is coming from the products API, I do not know how to I set the state. If I have to set the state, I have to know if that is an array or an object. So the backend developer will give you a sample response. This is a sample response, and you start coding depending using the sample response. Whenever the API is ready, you just swap the fake API with the real API right in here. And there are a lot and lot of applications, online websites where they give you a fake API. Just you have to just give you a fake data. Like in this case, like my JSON is one of that. I can just copy the data. I can copy this URL, go back in here, .json, that's get me a JSON data. This is my sample data. I come back in here, post my sample data, and I would get my API. So I would use this API in here, and my UI would still functional. And give it a refresh on my API. I'm not using the products API in here. I'm not using the products URL in here. So let's go back and switch it back in here. Let's see what's going on. Okay, so I'm using a random JSON in here, so I'll give it a refresh. Use this API, use this data, which in my case would be a fake data, and then I would go to my URL, copy this in here, and give it a save. That should create me a fake API. I'll take this fake API and put it back into my application. Okay, and then give it a run, and you should able to see I'm still getting this data, but this is not the real data. This is not, I'm just not getting from the real database. This is just a fake database that I have created. This is what you do when a backend developer gives you data, a response, you put that into a random a fake server. Guys, another thing, it's always a good idea to see if your company is offering any kind of a fake server, because you're not supposed to put your company's data out into some random website. So try to check with your team and see if they have any local server that you can spin it up and try to put the fake data. Or a best idea is always hard code the values into your code right away, so you don't have to depend on an API. But there are some instances where you really have to care about the status codes, right? A status code only be generated by a response from an API. In that cases, there's no other go. You have to depend on a fake server, or you can just hard code the status codes. But it's a good idea to play to keep up as close to the real API, because we never know what issues we're gonna run into. So I'm switching this back to the real API back in here, and then go back to index.js and try to serve the add product. Okay, and then I try to add something in here. Now that would be added to the database. Are we clear on this? I'm trying to post the data. The posting would always add a new record. I'm not putting a data. So see what happens if I put the data. Go to add product. Instead of post, I simply say put. Okay, and give it a save. Check the database. Check the database, some random number, some random URL, some category, and add. See what happened. It's just replacing the entire record with the current database, with the current key that I'm using it. But now this is very specific to this is very specific to Firebase, but there are APIs where you can use to post a new record or put a new record. It again depends on how your backend structure is, how your backend APIs have been architected. In our current case, in order to add a new item into the database, we would do something very different. Let me reset this back, the database backend. So I'm using a handle add method to, okay, for some reason it was stopped recording and it's recording back again. So let's go over that real quick for one more time. If you have a piece of information, if you have a piece of data that you have to post on an API, and that information is not within the UI and it depends on getting the data from another API. So you get the data from another API, and then you post the data to another API. So this is how we do it. We make an API call. Under the callback function, we make another API call. So we make the first API call, and then we wait for it. We get the data, and then we make another API call. So I'm using the fetch call again in here to make an API call. I'm throwing a debugger in here, and let's see what we get on inside our products API. So I'm interested in how many products I have it on my API. Okay, and you see I'm getting an array response in here, which says I have 31 items on the UI, which on 31 items on the database. So I use array dot length in order to calculate my number of items on the database. So constant product count is equal to the response JSON dot length. All right, folks. Then I make another API call. But now I would, instead of using the hard-coded value of 30, I would use the product count right in here. Okay. And now if I use a product count like that, that becomes a string, because I need a variable inside a string. So what I would do, I can do in two different ways. I can say backslash comma number, I'm sorry, not number, then dot in here. Now that becomes of the product count, then becomes a variable. It's no longer a string. And this is using ES5 way of doing it, but ES6 has a better way of doing it, and this is called string literals. This is called string literals because you're literally writing a string into it. So you can do something like this: backslash, remove all the single quotes, and use a backtick. A backtick is right on top of your tab key. Use a backtick and a backtick. Remove all the plus. And whenever you have a variable inside the string, use a dollar and a curly brace. And this is called string literal. And if I have 30 products, this string literal would be something like this. It would be replace my product count with number 30. If it has 31, it would be 31 or 32. Okay. Again, I'm reiterating, this is not an efficient way of putting an item to the database. This example only is trying to show you how you make an API call. How do you post the data to an API call, which the data depends getting the data from another API call. Okay, and let's do that back again. Give it a save, a refresh, and go to our API call, database. Okay, and I'm just trying to delete the last item in here, which is rubbish. And then I would add the data back again. Which is this guy, and add. And you see, add the item to the 30th. Now I'll add another item in here. My data is still intact. I'm not clearing the inputs yet. And I add another item in here, and you can see this item is going to 31st. Now you guys tell me, after, as soon as I click on the add button, all my input fields should be cleared off. How can I do that?
You can reset the state.
Right, how do I reset the state, and when should I reset the state? Is it before or after posting the data? After posting the data. So when do I know that my data has been successfully posted?
Success response.
So how, where, which response, which one?
Dot then, after dot then.
Here?
If that comes out of that function, then default it could be a success response.
At one, okay, so help me understand at what point of time the data is posted here. Which line, from line number 58 to 68? Which line posts the data to the API?
64? Yeah,
64 does that for me. So if this fetch is successful, does it mean that data has been successfully posted, or this, if this fetch is successful, then mean that my data has been posted?
Both, because it is callback, right? So first function is to be get success, then only this could be.
Right. So or the first function is successful and then the second function is executed, the second fetch is executed. So I would depend on the second fetch because that's the last fetch.
Right.
And that's where I see if I would get the response in here. Okay, and I'll just throw in a debugger in here and see what is the response that I'm gonna get in here. And that stopped my debugger in there. And check the response. Let's go to right in here. So let's console log because it's still in the context. Okay. And this is where it shows me its status code 200 okay. And will depend on that response. If my stated response is 200 okay, if response, I would completely write that word, response, if response. See, at this point, I'm not getting the JSON because I'm not interested in the JSON part. So I'm only using one then in here. If response double equal to or triple equal to 200, then I would say this dot set state. I would
make
say
that payload empty.
Does it the payload or the state?
Oh, sorry, the state.
The state has to be empty, right? So state empty. Now let's go back and let's clear off let's reset the database. Okay, and I would add a valid values in here. Let me find the strawberry. I just need a strawberry image. Okay, I'll grab this one here. Open copy image address. Image address in here. Strawberry. Maybe 100 and category fruit. And let's add that for here and see what happens. It added, but it did not clear my state. What do you guys think would be the error? Let's inspect. It's a very familiar error. You guys are very familiar about it. Think about this. This dot set state supposed to be okay. So let's inspect and see if that is not going through the if loop or not. That is skipping the if loop because it's supposed to do not just the response. It's supposed to do response dot status. Awesome, Karthik. Okay, and let's give that another run and add and boom. Cool.
Cool.
Awesome. Any questions on here?
Is it the same functionality when you have a form and add button? Let's say it's a form submit button.
No, the form submit button is little different, and because we are using a custom form in here, because everything has a different input and sheet, you can use a HTML form as well.
That form type.
Yeah. The HTML form is a little different because it has a lot of inbuilt form types inputs where you can actually structure a form in a way like in a real form.
Right. In real scenarios, would we use form over inputs or
Uh,
over forms in React applications?
especially in React applications, guys, if you're using forms, there is something very famous, a package called React Forms.
Oh, forms.
So this is a package from the React. This is an npm package. Not able to find it. Let's go to npm.js and see. Yeah, this is the package. In recent times, there've been a very popular form handler called Formic. Now, uh, I think this is the best library to use inside a React for Formic. The reason being, Formic has a lot of options inside it. For example, one thing, you don't need to create a state for yourself. You can just pass in a configuration into the Formic, and the Formic would able to handle all the handle changes and all that stuff. And on top of that, it also does the validations for you. For example, in my form, I have a phone number.
So regex validation.
Yeah, I have a phone number. So I don't have to validate the phone number. I don't have to put an extra logic to validate that phone number. So there's a lot of validation objects that you can send in. Not just phone number, email, number of characters, max characters, least characters. You see in here, I'm using a Formic and the React. This is a very simple sample, and there is no state in here. I'm using a functional component, and I just say Formic, and I set the initial values, which is the initial values, and what should happen when I do a on submit. In this case, I'm not doing an on submit. I'm using an add button, but a Formic has an inbuilt on submit. What you can do, or you can bind your fetch calls APIs into this on submit. And it also has a validation schema. If the user is not entering the correct information, it would never submit. So a lot of business logic that goes into using the Formic will be handled by handling the forms is handled by the Formic. It got a lot of options. You see, as I type in some data and I'm just on blurring it, you can see this little message in here. You don't have to do this all by yourself. Formic has a lot of inbuilt stuff that helps you to do this. Yeah, look at that, how it says email, and it also giving me email. My email must be a valid email. So it gives me an object. It gives me a lot of values, submit count. If user is making more submit counts, like if you want to stop the user making repetitive calls to the API, you can go disable that button after like maybe 3 or 4 submits. This is a cool library. Check it out. And other than that, do you have any questions on the on-click events, posting the data to an API, nested fetch calls, and all that stuff? Actually, I'm done for today. Let me know if you have any questions.